Thank you so much. Thank you for that really kind introduction. Thank you to all of you for turning out tonight. It really means a lot. My deepest respect to the Ngunnawal people for having me here on your land, to the Gumbaynggirr people also and the Dunghutti people who also share in the community that we gather on today. Thank you to the Archibald family for inviting me and for being so generous. And I've spent the afternoon with members of the Archibald family and they made me feel like family. So thank you so much for having me here. Professor Moran, Vice-Chancellor, and your family, again, thank you for being so welcoming and for extending this opportunity to speak to you. Other First Nations people in the room, my respects to your people as well and from wherever you have travelled, and to everybody else. Your story has brought you here too, and you are the last stop on your ancestors' journeys, and you are now part of us as well. So welcome to all of you. Before I came to speak tonight, I thought I'd have a look at a few past Archibald lectures. All wonderful speakers, talking about things of great importance. Importance to Australia, importance to our people. And one struck me particularly, Dr. Ray Kelly.
Yes, my brother.
Your brother, part of this community and part of this family. And
his mother painted that.
She painted that. Well, I stand here tonight in his shadow as well, someone I deeply admire. And I was really struck by the way that he spoke about Grandfather Frank, as he called him. And he said he always remembers him walking proud. Walking proud. And when he said it, I could see the pride in Ray. And I look at that photo of Frank Archibald, and I see not just a proud man, but someone who could have been my own grandfather. When I look at his face, I see the faces of my grandfathers. My grandfather Keith, who was a Gamilaroi man from Coonabarabran, someone who was born under a tree, who lost the use of one of his lungs as a baby, whose mother passed away giving birth to him, who was brought up on the fringes of town, who had the audacity to love a white woman, who had the audacity to love him, and endured the rejection and the hatred of a country in 1930s Australia that would not accept that love. My grandfather and my grandmother lived in a little tin humpy on the outskirts of Coonabarabran. There they raised 13 children, losing 2 of them young, until one night the police came at gunpoint and bulldozed the little humpy to the ground. The love between my grandparents couldn't possibly last. But even after they separated, my grandfather moved from one home to another. He would always sit by a window and look down the river at where my grandmother was living in a caravan and dream of the love that they had together. And I stand here tonight as the person that those people and that love made me. I think about my other grandfather on my father's side, a Wiradjuri man, who fought a war for this country as a rat of Tobruk in World War II, to come back to a place where he was still not fully recognised as a citizen. Where, when he finally, after many years, marched on Anzac Day, he was turned away from the pub by the police, where he couldn't go in and share a drink with the mates that he'd served with. But he always told me about that day. He told me about something very special that happened. That as he stood there and the policeman said, "You can't come in here," the mates that he'd served with formed a circle around him and marched him in. I live with the legacy of my grandfathers, my grandmothers, I live with the legacy of all of my people. They are what have made me. The great Polish poet Czesław Miłosz, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, once said, "What if all memories are just the memories of wounds?" The memories of wounds. And yes, our memories are hard memories. Our history is a hard history. That history doesn't just form me. I am that history. As Aboriginal people, those stories are passed down to us. From childhood, we learn the stories of who we are, where we come from, who our people are, and the things that have happened on our land. I was born in the early 1960s to a Wiradjuri father, Gamilaroi mother, living on the fringes of Australia. As I've later described it, Australia was a foreign place. Australia was for other people. We were a black family and we were a poor family. Dad got work wherever he could, and Mum helped him out with whatever work she could find. It meant for the first 13 years of my life, we were homeless. When I stand here today, it's almost impossible to think that the little boy that was born on the fringes of Australia would grow up to travel the world, to see things unimaginable, to sit in the White House with Barack Obama, the first black president of the United States, to sit with Nelson Mandela, the first black president of South Africa, to have reported from more than 80 countries. But I'm always that little boy. I want to show you a photo. It is the only photo that exists of me at school. We moved around so much that I barely went to school. I changed schools 13 or 14 times before I was even into high school. If we could get that photo up on the screen. I'm the little boy, just second from the end in the middle row in front of the teacher. That's Braidwood's second grade in 1971, which will tell you how old I am. I was probably only at that school for 6 weeks, just long enough to have the photo taken, and I cannot remember the name of a single other kid in that photo. And it looks like any other school photo, except when you look a little bit more closely. Look closely at that photo. My uniform doesn't match the other kids. My jumper is a second-hand jumper Mum got. There's a stain that runs down the front of it. Look at the eyes of that little boy. They're terrified. That little boy looks out onto the world with eyes of fear. Look closely at his hands. Look how tightly that little boy is gripping his hands. By the time I was in second grade, I'd learned some things about the world. That little boy knew that he was black, and he was poor, and he did not belong. The very first memory I have of school is sitting on the floor in kindergarten and a little white boy in the class putting his arm next to mine and saying, "Why are you so black? Why are you so black?" There's no answer to that question. I can still remember how I felt and the little nervous smile that I got on my face because I didn't know what that meant. I was from a Wiradjuri family, a Gamilaroi family. I didn't know what it means to be black, to be different. But that little boy was not just asking me to explain the colour of my skin. He was teaching me a lesson about where I belonged in the world. Think about that. That little boy never had to ask why he was so white. Never would have occurred to him. The teacher was white. The other kids in the class were white. The people who worked in the shops that we stopped at on the way home from school were white. The people on television were white. To be white was normal. He wasn't just asking me an innocent question about the colour of my skin. He knew, even at the age of 5, he knew that he had the right to ask me that question. He knew that he had the power to ask me that question. And there's no answer to that question. Because whatever answer you give, it will not be good enough. Why are you so black? Are you even human? We know, Aboriginal people, what that question means. Because that question meant that our land could be taken. That question meant that we could be locked up on missions and reserves. That meant that our children could be taken from us. To be black was something that you had to explain. I told another Aboriginal boy in one of the other classes, he was the adopted son of the Presbyterian minister and his wife. We rushed home that afternoon. He told his mother, "Mum, someone asked Dan today why he's so black. Are we black?" And I can still remember what his mother said. His mother said, "No, you're not black. You've just got lovely olive skin." In one day, I learned something about the world. I learned that a little boy had the right to ask me to explain myself. I knew there was no answer to that question. And I was told that to be black was something to be ashamed of. It wasn't long after that my mother walked in on me having a bath, and I was rubbing my skin red raw. And she asked me what I was doing, and I said, "I'm trying to rub the black off." What a terrible thing to do to a little boy. Not to say that we should be proud of who we are, not to say that the colour of our skin is something special, not to say that we come from a great culture, a great civilization, not to say that we are loved, but to say you should be ashamed of yourself. And for a little boy to know that the colour of his skin was something he wanted to get rid of. I moved around so often that I barely got an education at all. But everywhere I went, we were that black family, that poor family. When I say poor, I don't mean are we going to be able to pay the rent or the electricity or whether we could get the fridge fixed. I'm saying I don't know if we'll eat tonight. My father lost the tips of 3 of his fingers working in sawmills trying to put food on our table. His body was like a battleground. He wore the wounds of a country that had been so brutal. On his shoulder is a stab wound the size of a 50-cent piece. On his foot is a steel plate. He put a huge lump on his foot that he can't put his shoe over the top of. He's got tattoos up his arms and across his chest. He would come home exhausted every day from whatever work he could find, just for a simple meal, maybe a hot bath, and then back up to do it again. My mother would swallow her pride to knock on the door of churches to ask for food relief. I can still remember what it felt like to go with my mother into the shop, walk up and down the aisle, adding up everything that we got so that it didn't go over the amount that the church had given us, and then waiting until everyone else had left the shop so that we could go up there and hand over the little piece of paper that meant that we could eat tonight. When I think about my childhood, I don't think about a home because we didn't have one. I don't think about a school because I was rarely there. I think about a car at night on a lonely, dark road with 4 kids crammed into the back seat, my grandfather often there with us, my mother and my father in the front seat. And on those long, dark nights when we were travelling looking for somewhere to belong, some way in, I'd listen to my parents and I'd look at them. My mother sometimes would light up a cigarette. She never smoked, but she'd always light up the cigarette and she'd pass it across to my father. And I always thought that there was something so beautiful, so intimate in that little act of love. In that car was all we had. In that car was all of our hope. The hope that maybe in another place, maybe tomorrow, things would be better. Every mile they travelled, every indignity they suffered, every time someone didn't serve them in a shop, every time someone turned us away, their pride and their love grew stronger. And that's put me here today. The way that I grew up, the history that I grew up with, that is so familiar to other Aboriginal people here tonight, means that I've always asked one question. The one question that's haunted me no matter where I've gone. How do you live with dignity in a world of catastrophe? That's what Ray was saying about Grandfather Frank. Look at that photo of that man. What do you see? You see dignity. Dignity. Our people, our old people, have such pride and such dignity and such love. And I always wondered, where did Mum and Dad get the dignity to go on? Let me put it another way. You get your guts kicked out. You get turned away from a country that doesn't want you. You endure hatred and racism. Then try to love. Try to love in the face of hate. That's what our people do. My life has been ridiculous. It's been beyond anything I could possibly have imagined. The little question that I was asked on that kindergarten floor, why are you so black, it never ended. When I was 14 years old, I was called up to the principal's office with other Aboriginal kids at Griffith High School. And the principal told us, and I've never forgotten that day, he said, you will amount to nothing. You will amount to nothing. What a thing to say to 14-year-old kids. He said, it's better you leave school because there's no place for you here. Some of the boys I was with that day did leave school, and some of those boys are no longer alive. I got lucky. I got so lucky. We moved away to Canberra. My father got another job. We moved to another town. My sister and I were the only Aboriginal kids in the school. It didn't get any easier. On the first day of school, I had to stand in front of the class and introduce myself. I told them about who I was and where I was from. I told them about being a Wiradjuri person. I told them about my family. And I came back in after recess to find written on the blackboard, and apologies for the language, be kind to Stan. Abos need love too. Never ends. It didn't end. But my parents would never allow me to surrender our dignity. They raised me for something better. I got so lucky. I got lucky to go to university. I got lucky to get into journalism and to have a career that's taken me around the world. And wherever I went, I've asked that one question. How do you live with dignity in a world of catastrophe? How do you love when you've lost everything? I've seen love in the worst places. I couldn't even begin to tell you about the horrible things that I've seen as a reporter. I covered war in Iraq and Afghanistan. I worked in Jerusalem and Gaza and the West Bank. I covered war in Syria. I've seen the worst of what we can do. I've stood in bombed out marketplaces where the blood on the ground was so thick that it stuck to the soles of my shoe, where mothers picked out bits of burning flesh because it's all they had left to bury of their children. I've seen the worst of what we can do. And in the worst places, I've seen human dignity and human love. I'm often asked, what's the most important story you've done? Who are the most impressive people you've interviewed? And I've interviewed a lot of impressive people, but no one more impressive than simple people living in the face of catastrophe. I remember once in Pakistan, after an earthquake, where more than 200,000 people had been killed, entire villages had disappeared. And I was driving back one evening and I saw a tent in the middle of a field and a lonely light. And I stopped and I said to my cameraman, let's go across there. We got to the tent and there was a mother out the front and she was cooking food on an open fire. Inside the tent was a man and his 2 children. This family had lost their home in the earthquake. Their eldest son had been killed and was buried under the rubble. They couldn't even find his body. The father had carried his other son, who had a broken leg and broken ribs. He carried him for 40 kilometres down the side of a mountain to come to a place where they could get a tent and some food relief. All they had in the world was in that little tent. And when the mother finished cooking the food, the first thing she did was offer it to me. Can you believe that? The love of people. To offer food to a stranger before they would eat when they have lost everything. I've seen the strength of the human spirit everywhere. And it took a toll on me. Covering war, covering the worst of the world, laid me low. Because I wasn't just reporting the suffering of other people, I was being reminded of the suffering of my own people. That mother that cooked that food, that's my mother. That father that carried his son, that's my father. Wherever I saw the worst of the world, I saw the possibilities of love in the world. Sometimes I despair at the state of our world, and there is a lot to despair about. We're living at a time of environmental disaster. We're living in a time that Pope Francis has already called World War III. There are endless wars, forever wars in our world. We know that there are people tonight who don't know whether tomorrow will come. We live in a world where people have so much and other people have so little. I've lived and worked in the United States, and I look at the US election campaign right now. In a country that's meant to be a beacon of hope for the world, a country that's meant to be the last hope for democracy, and a country that can barely govern itself. In America, the top 1% of the population has wealth 13 times greater than the bottom 50% combined. It is criminal. In America, the richest country in the world, for the first time in 100 years, life expectancy is going down. People are dying younger than their parents in the richest country in the world. At a time when there was meant to be so much hope, when Barack Obama became president. An amazing time to see a black man elected president of a country that held black people in slavery. The numbers of deaths of despair. People who were dying out of hopelessness, dying from drug overdose, from gun-inflicted wounds, killing themselves in trailer parks. the numbers of people between the ages of 40 and 55 dying early deaths of hopelessness tripled in a country where they were being told they should have hope. We are capable of doing so much that is wrong to each other. And there are so many people who remain out of sight, the poor, the black, the brown, the marginalised. And yet even in those places, I've seen hope, real hope, not the hope that politicians want to tell us about, but the hope of a mother offering food to a stranger, the hope I saw from my father, the hope I saw from my grandparents. Australia is not untouched by the worst of our democracies. 200 plus years after our country was invaded, our land was taken, Aboriginal people remain the most impoverished and imprisoned people in the country. We know that we have the worst rates of youth suicide, mental illness, the worst education, employment, housing, health outcomes of any other Australians. I look at the way that the struggles of my people are reported in Australia, and it's almost again like it was for me when I was a little boy, a foreign country. Think about it. Whenever there's a reporting on Aboriginal communities, it's always as if it's out there, some other place. If in an Australian town it was more likely for an Aboriginal child to go to jail than go to university, if in an Australian town people were living 30 to a house, if in an Australian town youth suicide was 5 times higher than the rest of the country, we'd do something about it. But this is just in Aboriginal communities. Out of sight, out of mind, just like the poor of America, in the richest countries in the world, the most vulnerable people can suffer the most. We were reminded last year in the referendum year, when we asked Australia to see us, to be better, to give us a voice in a constitution that was originally written to exclude us, to say yes. And I remember sitting there on that night of the referendum, and even in my worst of times, I could not possibly have imagined how quickly that no vote came in. Within a matter of an hour, it was all over. Not one single state in Australia said yes. Not one. The most impoverished and imprisoned people in Australia. Australia found so easy to just say no. It was a hard year for me last year. It was a hard year for a lot of people. But being an Aboriginal person in the public eye, being someone on television, meant that I became a target for hatred. My family was constantly attacked on social media. My children constantly abused. My parents abused. My wife abused. Not just racial abuse, but death threats. One person was arrested and charged for making threats against us. And at that point, I decided to walk away. To walk away from a career that I had loved, a career that had taken me to places I could never have imagined. A career that meant I was the first Aboriginal person to host a nightly current affairs program where I could speak to the most powerful people in the country. But I knew I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stay in a place where my family were going to be targeted in that way. And I could not stay in a media that found it so easy to peddle hatred. When I walked away from hosting Q&A, I said, I don't believe the media has the language or the love to speak to the gentle spirits of our country. Did not have the language or the love. I've thought a lot in the past year about that vote, about our country, about the state of our world, and what we can do about it. I can't stop the wars. I can't stop the rise of despots and autocrats. I can't eradicate poverty. I can't even stop our people going to jail or another generation of Aboriginal kids being raised in hopelessness and despair. But I can begin by changing myself. I had to ask hard questions about my own role in the media, about how I speak to other Australians who found it so easy to say no. Over the past year, I've spent a lot more time back on my own country, connecting to that place that makes me feel whole, filling my spirit. And going back to the lessons that Frank Archibald would have told us, that my grandfathers would have told us, that Aboriginal people never lose our dignity and we never give in to despair. At a time when things could appear so hopeless, I've reconnected to what is the most fundamental thing about us. We are spiritual people. That's what Aboriginal people are. One of the old uncles today, one of the members of the Archibald family, came up to me and he said, "There are 4 things that we are, son." He said, "We're heavenly people. We're earthly people. We're spiritual people. And we're water people." Heaven, earth, spirit, and water. For tens of thousands of years, our people knew what it was to live in a place of God and creation and beauty. We can't be healthy, we can't be healed if our spirits are broken. I've spent so much time in the past year reconnecting to my country, my ancestors, and my spirit. Tonight you would have heard that I've studied for a doctorate in theology. Why theology? Because theology asks the hardest questions. I don't ask if God is real. No Aboriginal person can. Because we live in God's cathedral every day in the beautiful country that God's given us. But I've had to ask, does God care? In the worst places in the world, in the war zones that I've covered, I've cried out, where is God? Where is God in all of this suffering? And then I realised that it's not God that's doing the suffering, inflicting the suffering. It's human beings. There's a wonderful French philosopher, Simone Weil. She said that human beings are reduced to just a thing, something no longer human. She called these people the afflicted. We are the afflicted, the impoverished and imprisoned. We are the afflicted. But she said the inflicted know the truth. Everyone else lies. And the truth is that only love can save us. Only love. Not the love that we see on television, not the love that we read about in books, but the love of where we are in our world, our ancestors, our country, our kinship. The love that we give before we ask to receive. I've reconnected to the idea of Yindyamarra. Yindyamarra is a Wiradjuri way of being. Yindyamarra means to be kind, to be quiet, to be respectful. Yindyamarra Winangana, in my language, means to live with respect in a world worth living in. How do we build a world worth living in? It starts by giving love, even to those people who may want to do us harm, even to the people who hate us. I've had to realise that it's not just enough to tell people about the bad things that have happened on our land. I can't stand here today and talk about history and tell you about how bad things have been unless first I have offered the love for you so that you may hear me. And that's where I went wrong. For too many years I thought I had the truth. I knew what had happened to my people, but I was not offering enough love. My old people have reminded me that first we love. We are people of spirit and we are people of love. It is the only antidote to the hatred in our world. We can't fix our world with politics. We can't vote our way to freedom. We can't expect that justice will be the answer because there is not enough justice for the terrible things that we've done in our world. But there might be enough love. My mother and father are old now. My dad has given back so much to his country. He helped rescue Wiradjuri language. He wrote the first Wiradjuri dictionary. He's taught a whole new generation of Wiradjuri people to speak. Just as you sit here today remembering Frank Archibald and his legacy, Sarah and her legacy, the legacy of your old people. I remember the legacy of my people and my father and my mother. They're old now, but they have never ever stopped loving and they've never stopped showing dignity. What they ask of me, what they ask of all of us, is to build a better society, to not turn away from the poor, to not turn away from the black, from the brown, from the suffering people. To not look at other people and see an enemy, but to see ourselves. There's a beautiful phrase that a French writer once used. He said, the shortest journey to the self is through the other. The shortest journey to the self is through the other. My faith tells me that we must forgive even those who do us wrong. Love is the only antidote to a world of hate. Yindyamarra is the only response to a country that finds it so easy to say no. I've never stopped being that little boy in that photo. Despite all the things that I've been so fortunate to do in my life, I'm still the scared little boy in that photo, looking out on a world with his eyes full of fear and holding his hands so tightly together they feel as if they're going to break. But I've covered a lot of miles since then. And while I'm still that little boy, the little boy knows that even in the worst of times, there is the hope for a love that transcends the worst of who we are. If anything at all honours the legacy of people like Frank Archibald, if anything honours the legacy of my grandparents, if anything honours the legacy of our ancestors, it is that in a country that finds it so easy to say no, we have to find it within ourselves to say yes to the capacity to love the other person on our country. In my language, Mandangu, thank you.